Excerpt, as I had stated earlier, uh, it is 25 marks, and of course, it is a set from the compulsory text. And I had mentioned about fathers of nations, and of course, the Samaritan. An excerpt is a set on episodic scenes. These are key areas in a text, and you realize that there are various questions testing on the plot development, yes. There are areas testing on thematic concerns. There are questions testing on stylistic devices. Mhm. There are other area on grammar, but of course we shall not be talking of grammar before, because we have talked about it before. And there is also semantics, or the meaning of words. We had also explained that. And there is also a question on paraphrasing, like I have just stated. But then I'll mention some of the areas that I have not mentioned before. One area that gives the learners headache is on this question. Uh, Explain or tell what happens before this excerpt. What happens before this excerpt? In this question, it can be phrased differently. Tell us what happens before this excerpt. That's a single question. Or another one is tell us what happens after this excerpt. So, as a single question. So, when you are told, uh, say what happens before this excerpt, uh, is different from the way you are told, state what happens after this excerpt. So, before is the incidences that happens. You are giving a brief summary right before that particular excerpt that is given. So one challenge that the students face is when they give way too much ahead of information. They get beyond the expected place, and that's why I tell the student that they have to really understand the plot. They have to make the text part and parcel. They have to make the text part of them, like the way you watch episodes in movies and you're able to explain them. That is the same way you should do in understanding the plot of these texts if you want to get it better. Uh, so, uh, don't go beyond the excerpt, and you're told before this excerpt. For example, I may refer you to the incident where we find Professor uh, Karanja Kimani in the novel Fathers of Nations confronting newborn Walomu. Of course, he has confronted him concerning the fact that Asia has actually been taken by Walomu to be his fourth wife. Of course, Professor Kimani confronts Walomu, calling him names. For example, he calls him a fat baboon. So, you can be given an excerpt from that episodic point that brings about a fight between our Lomo and Professor Karanja. So don't talk of any other incidences before there. Talk of maybe a short summary, a brief summary. Walumu uh, visits. Walumu visits the office of, sorry, Professor Karanja visits the office of a newborn Walumu, whereby he derogatorily greets him, calling him a fat baboon. Of course, it depends on where the excerpt starts. So, at the end, what happens? To give a summary, if it is 4 marks, remember each point you give is supposed to be 1 mark. So ensure you give points giving you 4 marks. If you have been told state what happens after this excerpt, then it means you have to state also immediately after that excerpt, and still don't go beyond. Ensure you get it right. Um, there is another way of phrasing that question. It has been phrased before, like place this excerpt in its immediate context. When you hear place this excerpt in its immediate context, it means you really have to give what happens before and also what happens after. So remember, we had separated the two, what happens before and what happens after. But when you are told you place this excerpt in its immediate context, you are being simply told to state what happens before and also what happens after. So I hope that one has been understood. Another area that gives learners a problem is on the styles, giving styles, stylistic devices. You find the learners have been asked, for example, give and explain for example, 2 character traits of Walomu. So give and explain 2 character traits of Walomu. So one of the challenge is that students identify, but they fail to explain. So remember, identification, you only get 1 mark, which is the right identification. You only get 1 mark. Why lose the mark for illustration? You don't need to lose that mark for illustration. Uh, Write or identify and also explain. For example, you're identifying Walomu is greedy. Walomu is greedy. Uh, you have identified why is he greedy. You continue explaining. He is greedy because he had already had 3 beautiful wives, and he still wanted to marry another wife, the fourth, who is Asia, and in fact, Asia being another man's wife. That is an indication of being greedy. So you can say Walum is greedy. Ensure you give 2. If you're talking of him being immoral, so say he is immoral. Remember, you are using adjectives to explain character traits. Use adjectives. So in saying immoral, talk of him having uh, uh, being promiscuous in such a way that he had slain so many on the way, meaning that he had actually had many women. He was immoral. The fact that he actually wanted Asiya, who was actually married to a man who was actually his senior at the university. And in fact, the fact that Asiya is quite old is quite old than him, there is enough proof that Walomu is immoral. So you have to explain. So don't use verbs. Don't also use nouns to explain character traits. So, for example, don't say that Walomu is a greed. Don't say that Walomu is greed. Instead, say Walomu is greedy, because greed is a noun. Remember. Also avoid repetition when you are giving uh, uh, these character traits. Avoid repetition. For example, um, uh, most students will write that so and so is loving. They have a good explanation. So and so is loving. Then they state down there that so and so is caring. So this is a repetition. This is the repetition. Avoid repetition. And of course, ensure you don't stroke, because when you stroke character traits, it means you have to explain both of them. For example, a student talking of the examples we have just talked about, he is greedy, stroke, immoral. For you to get it right, you have to explain both. Otherwise, you will not get any if you stroke. Ensure you also don't illustrate without identification. So illustration alone will not give you any mark. So you have to state and then you illustrate. That is on characteristics or character traits.